Welcome. Thank you all for coming to the first of a series of the CITP Lunch Seminar Series. I want to remind everyone this talk is being recorded. Before I talk about this amazing talk that you're about to see, I want to give a bit of background about CITP. It's a Center for Information Technology. And we work to understand and improve the relationship between technology and society. We take both of those things very seriously, understanding and improving. So in terms of understanding, we do research that advances the state of the art. And in terms of improving, we work hard to engage with policymakers to make our insights available to them. We also work really hard to engage with policymakers to figure out what are the right kinds of problems to be working on. And I think that description of CITP leads very naturally into Mihir Kshirsagar, who is our speaker for today, and the work he's doing at the CITP clinic. So the CITP clinic is a new part of CITP. It started about a year ago, and Mihir has been leading this effort to help improve our engagement with the world and make that engagement more productive. Mihir is going to talk a little bit more about his background in the talk, so I will just limit my introduction by saying that it has been a real pleasure to watch Mihir create this organization and these set of activities out of to really reimagine what we can be doing inside of a university and how we can connect in different ways with the world. And so I think this is really one of the most exciting things happening at CITP and at Princeton. And so it's my great pleasure now to turn it over to Mihir so he can tell you more about himself and more about the work that he's been doing at the clinic. So Mihir.
Thank you, Matt. That was very helpful. And thank you everyone for joining the first seminar in the fall, and we're looking forward to an exciting series up ahead. So I'm going to talk about the clinic and situate it within what I see as the existing models for education, how we've sort of conceived of what should be the clinic's model, and then describe some of the projects we're thinking of and think about what are the future directions to consider for the clinic. So this is a quick overview of what I'm going to do. Yep.
Before Mihir gets started, I just want to add one point of context about how we're going to work in this Zoom setting. This is a new setting for all of us. So the idea would be you can type your questions into the Q&A box. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen that you see a button that says Q&A. You can type your questions into there and I'll serve as a moderator. So to the extent that your question is a question of clarification, I may chime in and interrupt Mihir as I've just done. But to the extent that it's a question that leads more to discussion, I will hold that until the end and we'll answer those at the end. So feel free to type your questions as we go and I will do my best to moderate them. So sorry to interrupt Mihir.
No, that's perfect. Yeah. So this is just a quick overview of the different points I'm going to hit today. And let me start with the context. So the context here is that CITP's had, as Matt described it, a rich history of understanding and improving the role of technology in public life. We've been doing this since 2005. And I think the sort of unique attribute of CITP is that we bring to it a kind of scientific expertise and rigor to the kinds of interventions that you can have in public life. And so we're now in an era where there's an exploding role of technology in public life, starting with the most fundamental issues facing us today of systemic racism, to privacy, security, and the use of technology to improve the delivery of public services. And so there are many different roles that technology can play in public life. And I have sort of broken it out into three different levels of policy making. One is the federal or the international, and that's one area that you can focus on. There's a lot of exciting work going on at the state and local level where politicians and public officials are responding to concerns and they can be nimble and respond quickly. And so that's another level, and I know a little bit about that as I'll describe it. And then it's important to also think of firms. The big entities, Facebook, Google, Amazon, are increasingly playing roles that are very akin to policymaking roles, and they are an important source of making policy and affecting people's lives. And so the central question is, how can scholars help respond to these technology policy challenges? And how can the clinic be situated to help them do that? And I'll describe my background, and I'm a lawyer by training, and I came to this with the view of saying, how do we figure out the best ways to find answers to these very challenging questions? So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up over here on the left, is where I grew up in Mumbai. And then I came to the United States, and I went to this place, funny little place called Deep Springs, which is the picture um, down with the tree. And then I became a cowboy there, which is probably the most important part of my education, where Deep Springs is a small college out west, and you learned how to think practically and apply theory in a very practical way. And so that was instrumental to how I approached a lot of the questions as I've gone through my career. In my career, I started off after graduating. I worked at Epic, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, and there I worked on the Total Information Awareness Project, trying to kill it. It was a DARPA project, which we were successful in getting it stalled. Those of you who may recall it, it was this effort to suck in all the data and communications from various different sources, make profiles of people, and then predict where the likely threats are going to come from. And it was a very big brother approach, and fortunately was one that we didn't adopt at the time. I then also did work on the public voice, which is to help work on international issues of free speech and the like. And then I went to law school, like most people do who are interested in policy. And then I switched to doing litigation, and litigation involved trying to distill a whole range of complex facts into simple, persuasive stories, and to try and convince a court or policy like the Federal Trade Commission, for example, to approve of a merger. And so I had a range of experiences in those areas. At Cravath, that was one of my cases that I worked on, which is actually quite useful in thinking about a lot of the issues facing us today, is the Amex case, which involved platform liability. And then I worked at another big law firm at Cahill on First Amendment and securities issues. And there, again, I had exposure to how do you represent the complex risk models that S&P had developed to predict credit risk, to think about, why did those models fail to predict the financial crisis? What were the responsibilities for the people who came up with those models, and how do you defend that? So I say all that because I have, and then most immediately I was at the New York Attorney General's office and working in the Bureau of Internet and Technology, and there I was a lead trial lawyer in actions against the broadband providers for misrepresenting internet speeds, and we got a big consumer protection recovery, and I got to work on a whole range of issues. But the sort of theme that I got through my different experiences, and sort of why am I in academia today, is that I could see that there was a gap between policy making and research, and one of the main things that were missing was that there was a series of sort of opinions that you received, but there wasn't geared to the kind of policy challenges that lawmakers had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I also noticed that there was a lot of complexity in the issues that we faced, and that requires good judgment and a sense of ethics. And you could see that that element was something that people were not getting as much training in as they went through it. And I observed that it was really critical in sort of crafting stories for litigation or working, is to understand the different incentives of the players and to figure out a way to tell stories. and that was an important role that I thought was important for students to understand and to develop in this way. And the way to do it was through this high touch method, which is, you work very closely with the students and help them get ahead. So the motivating questions were, how do we train future policymakers and how do we advance the public interest? And so here are some existing models for academia, and this is sort of a rough taxonomy just to give you a sense for what it is. There's the academics who are supporters of a particular point of view, and you're pulled out to give support to a particular position. You may play the role of an explainer, where you have to explain a complex concept to somebody. You could be an advisor, and then you could be a theorist, and the theorist either provides new perspectives or provides a new way of approaching an issue, which I classify as sort of breaking logjams, or you can expand the Overton window. You expand the range of possibilities just by suggesting a different way to look at things. And then you can be an advocate. And that's increasingly a role that some scholars are taking on, where you are trying to advocate for certain policies. So the clinic model is something that I think Ed Felton and Tidhi and Matt, when they were thinking about this, were thinking about this from the law school clinics. And the law school clinical model has an interesting history that's sort of worth touching on. It started off in the 1960s as a Ford Foundation project, and it came out of the recognition that the existing methods of teaching students about law were lacking for several reasons. One is that it didn't really give the students a practical, experiential sense of learning, and to learn by doing and examine how you perform by watching real life situations, to respond to that, to figure out how ethics work in practice, and to give students an early taste of what it means to work in the public interest, to work in public service. And so that model was very successful and was exported out over the years, and it went into the tech law clinic. Started in the 90s. There's the Harvard Cyber Law Clinic, and then there's a series of the Samuelson Glushko Foundation funded a series of clinics all over the country. And they worked on a variety of issues: copyright and intellectual property, civil liberties, and then increasingly now data and privacy. And today there are about 37 of these different law school clinics. And the law school clinic model is based on having students, a small group of students, work on a case for a client. And then often the cases involve working for clients who might have a hard time finding representation. So people who have, homeless people, or people who are looking for public benefits or immigration. And the tech law clinics too have taken on clients who are working in the public interest, and they have a direct person that they're trying to help, and they write briefs or they help them navigate the public infrastructure to get the benefits that are due to them. They have also expanded over time into more advocacy work, and you're seeing white papers and presentations and things like that coming out of clinics to influence policy at a broader level. And then that's what's going on in the law school world. In the more traditional academic world of computer science departments and others, you're starting to see as well some efforts to engage more directly with the public interest in finding ways to directly engage with it. So the policy labs that have come up at the University of Washington, Carnegie Mellon, and Harvard. And these are efforts to, again, engage with the public interest. And so as we're trying to think about how we design our clinic here, what principles should we emphasize? And so uh, the traditional Princeton pillars are teaching, research, and service, as you all know, and so in my mind, the clinic has to play a role of complementing this traditional learning model. And I'm going to describe how it depends on sort of creating this virtuous loop between policymaking, research, and the insights. Uh, and the role of the clinic in policy is is important to sort of specify in advance, right? What are we trying to do? What are the kinds of things that the clinic is trying to achieve, and what are the things we're not going to be able to do? And so I think the clinic's role in policy is to collect evidence, present results, develop analysis and recommendations, and create spaces for two-way learning between the policy community and the research community, and then help policymakers navigate complexity. And there's a lot of complexity in the new technologies, and many parties with incentives to describe technological results in particular ways, and we can provide a nonpartisan, clear explanation of how the policy is going to be affected by the technology. What are the big open questions, and how can we help answer those questions? So that's a very important role for the clinic, especially in a world where the clinic is not necessarily going to have a particular client that we're going to represent and help work on one particular problem with them. So this is sort of the big picture understanding I have of how the clinic should conceive itself, is that there's a policy question on one side, and that generates research questions. What are questions that the policymakers have that should motivate research? And then the researchers go out and they gather evidence or they gather insights and then feed that back into the policy and have that loop continue. And it's all centered around the human stories of what people are experiencing. And I say that because sometimes I think we lose sight of that. When we talk about, for example, algorithmic fairness, it can become a very abstract discussion. And part of the goal is to say, well, how does it affect people on the grounds? What are the human problems that these technological solutions are trying to address, and how well are they addressing them? And so that question remains at the center of any attempt to find good policy. And so that's why it's at the center. But the idea is to create a space where at the top, where there's research goes on here at Princeton, we bring in students and scholars to do policy relevant research, bring their hard questions, think through the challenging ways you can respond to that through developing evidence, through developing new insights and new directions, and then use that to influence policy, and hopefully over time have some of the students and scholars who've done the research, maybe they've go on to work in the policy world, and they will in turn bring their problems back to us, and have the clinic and CITP be a space where they can address the challenging questions that they face, and have a place where they can learn from each other and learn from the experts here at CITP. So in terms of project selection, how do we go about selecting projects? This is sort of roughly what we're thinking about. So what is the problem? Who does it affect? How does it affect them? What are the different possible approaches? And I think it's really important for policymakers that, and sometimes researchers perhaps don't miss this piece of it, is how does one approach compare to another one? And it's the compare to what question that Bonnie Franks had in one of these, which is, yes, I know, because usually researchers will come and say, well, this method's broken, this other method's broken, but you have to go with something. And so how do you compare that? How do you make an assessment about what's the best way to go forward? And in terms of the project selection, we have to focus on what is the insight that we have. Do we have something unique to contribute? Is there some research insight that is not otherwise available, or other parties don't necessarily have the incentives to look into those issues? And I think, in the area of machine learning, let's say, there are places where there are many interested parties with lots of different incentives. I think we have a very important voice to play in that debate by focusing on important questions about uh, how does machine learning work? What can it do? What can it not do? What are the limits to how we as a society should control and exercise oversight over machine learning algorithms? So that's an example of somewhere where we may have something unique to contribute. And then another part of it is, this an issue when it's a student project? Is this an issue that will challenge the student, right? So is this something that they will learn something from? And then the last part is to have some plan for how do we get heard. And it's not necessarily the case that we're looking to say, did we change X or Y policy? But because the choice of policies is subject to a lot of variation. But what you're trying to do is to say, make our material available and make sure that there are sources of information where we can provide a different perspective for policymakers and make sure that it's actually accessible to them. So that's a lot of theory. Let me get to discussing the specific projects we took on this year as a template for what we're trying to do, and then think about future directions. So the first year projects are, there was a teaching component, and then we organized some forums, which I'll get into. We did papers, and then we created experiences for students through the Public Interest Technology University Network Summer Fellowship Program, which I'll discuss. So in terms of teaching, I had 2 semesters of independent work seminars with computer science students, and we hope to expand that to others within Princeton. And the thing that I focused on in the teaching work was how to help students develop a voice. And this is pedagogically, I think, a very important feature of the program as I see it, which is that engineers and students with computer science backgrounds tend to feel like they may not have a voice in policy debates. It might be overwhelming. There may be too many details. Trying to understand the different incentive structures is tricky, and if you feel like you can't, if you're not expert in that, somehow you don't have a voice, is a common feeling and is a common experience. And so one of the things that I'm trying to help students develop is that you do have a voice, you have a perspective, you have a history, you have your awareness of the ethical concerns, and how do you develop a way to communicate those concerns? How do you learn to communicate through writing, which I spend a lot of time with students. One of the most productive things I've done is to work on multiple drafts with students. I insist on sort of getting early drafts and commenting and having them really define their writing, because writing is a critical part of any policymaking environment, and it's important for them to learn to communicate. And the other part is to learn to communicate to people through presentations and the like. And so I'll give you a sample of some of the topics that students took on. One student wrote a great paper on the implications of Google's acquisition of Fitbit and what a government should do about that. She did this before the European Union decided to take a closer look at that acquisition, and I think it was pretty gratifying to see that a lot of the things that she had picked up about the concerns about the acquisition were very much in line with what the European Commission eventually picked up on. There was a student who wrote comments to the FDA on adopting artificial intelligence. They were another paper on facial recognition transportation systems, the use of dark patterns in video games, and another one which I really liked was understanding how technology is used by child welfare agencies. And so this is an area where I think students can play a really important role in learning and explaining what is going on the ground and being able to translate that into papers that can inform policy at a higher level. And so gathering facts is a big piece of the independent work seminars, and trying to understand how policy is affecting people and what you can do about it. So I think that is that has been something that has been very gratifying to learn from the students about what are the major issues that concern them. How do they approach it? How do you break down an issue that you have concerns about into something that is policy oriented, that can communicate your concerns to a broader audience? And I've really enjoyed that process. I've also done some senior thesis advising on political misinformation, encryption, and 5G. Um, so the other thing that we've innovated this year, and we're trying to see how this is, I think it was a good experiment, and we're going to keep going with it, is a case studies way of thinking about policy problems. So to bring a domain expert into Princeton who has a policy problem, and what we do is we break it up into two sessions. The first session is to diagnose the situation. So rather than jumping straight into, here are all the responses, where are the experts, we're going to tell you what the responses are, we actually take the time to ask questions and make sure that we actually have a common understanding of the problem. What are the considerations? What are the issues? And then to propose in the second session some ways that we think research can help address those problems, or those the complexity that a policymaker is dealing with. One example of we had somebody from the New York Times come in talking about the advertising model for journalism, and how do you think about that, and what are the solutions, and can you think of developing contextual advertising rather than behavioral advertising. We had another one which I'll talk more about here, is with the Wikimedia Foundation, which had a problem with loud voices who would take over a lot of the major discussion and decision making within the organization. And how do they become a more inclusive organization? How do they develop tools to do that? And so we spent the first session understanding and diagnosing the situation. And the second one, we started to propose some studies and discuss potential approaches. And what we were able to do was to actually find, after that, there were some really interesting strands of potential solutions that we could work on together. And so this year we've taken that, and there's a fellow here, Ashley Gorham, who's going to be working on this, who's going to work closely with the Wikimedia Foundation to help think of ways in which they address decision making. So I view that as a very nice arc for the kinds of research work that the clinic can do, which is you bring in a domain expert to raise important questions, have those discussed, and that is a value to the domain expert as it is. Then for us to propose different studies, to have it be in this interdisciplinary setting, so that you can hear from the different people who are, graduate students and fellows and scholars from different departments and different disciplines coming in and saying, well, here's how we look at this issue. So you become kind of an incubator of potential responses, and you hear how different people with different backgrounds approach the issue. And then, if there is something of value, longer term value, that you can extract, maybe a research paper or something else that can come out of it, in a more concrete project for the domain expert, then that's something that we can pursue, and that's a longer term, and that's kind of a spin-off from the clinic. So that I view as sort of something that we should try to emulate. We also did, a forum on COVID testing and some of the privacy and security aspects of that. And actually, that directly, uh, we kind of had a discussion, and then we put together a series of points about what should be in a data security bill, and we were able to send that on to a New Jersey state legislator who's interested in these issues, and he was able to incorporate it into the draft legislation. So we can have that kind of very quick, direct impact as well, and I think there's going to be more of that to come. Uh, the last kind of forum thing that I want to touch on is a policy workshop that we did with the Federal Trade Commission, and that was an all-day session where we brought them in to discuss the issue of dark patterns, and this is again uh, a very different, I think, a different way of doing one of these workshops than perhaps others have done it, because we started out with the idea that we were going to spend some time exchanging ideas. It was not going to be a panel discussion where some people read papers and then you hear some comments, but we actually had an interactive seminar where we each brought our perspectives. We shared the kinds of learning that we thought were important, and really, I think, learned from each other about how different people approach the same questions. And I think there was certainly I know from the research side, when we're writing a paper in dark patterns and listening to how the FTC views this issue in a very granular way was very helpful for us. And I know for the FTC, participating in that policy workshop was really helpful for their team to understand, what are academics seeing, how do they see it, why is it important, what should the FTC do about these issues. So I hope, again, to have more of these kinds of workshops where we bring in domain experts and treat it closer to a seminar rather than sort of a one-way, here's what researchers have found, but really create a forum where you can try to work together to find problems to the human stories that I referred to before. Um, and then there's writing papers, and so we've done different groups of people at CITP have come together to write agency comments. We wrote comments on the FTC safeguard rule on data security, children's privacy, on the California privacy rules. These are just a few that we've written more, but I just wanted to give a few examples. And I hope to do these in a more systematic way, in the sense that some of these public agency comments were on topics different people had different areas of expertise already, and it was just a question of pulling together the existing expertise to respond to the questions. But as this develops and as more students and scholars get interested in this area, there is an opportunity to do this more proactively and to identify the agency comments that are important, and figure out how can we have research that helps address the questions raised in those agency comments, and how do we play, not just talk about research that we've already done, but think about how do we develop research to address those comments, and how do we engage more proactively in that process. And the comment process is a very valuable process. It's how agency work gets done. It's not just at the federal level, as you can see, we did it with California. There are many places where policymakers are starved for high quality recommendations, and I think if we can come in with recommendations that are grounded in solid research and can present it in a clear and simple way, that can have a huge influence on the debate. We may not prevail, as I said, in each instance, but we've set the context and we've set up important questions that policymakers won't easily ignore. And then there's also research papers that I've participated in, and one of them is on dark patterns. Another one, which is exciting, is on educational technology and what are the privacy and security implications of the remote communication tools. And that is actually something that emerged again from one of these case study discussions, and a group came together and said, okay, we can really write about this, and that's an ongoing project, and we hope to do something with that. And then with that paper, we hope to inform policymakers and partner with people who are expert at communicating with policymakers. So that's something that's going to come up. So what are the future directions? I'm going to spend the last 5-10 minutes of the talk, and I'm waiting to hear your questions. The Zoom format is such where it's hard to know how people are reacting to what you're saying here. So the future directions are, how do we scale, right? How do we make this, assuming that it is a good thing, which I think it is, how do we scale this? How do we expand our projects? How do we find new partners to work with? At the same time, we retain the high touch, right? I mean, what we're really giving students and scholars is a very close reading of a problem, and using that to educate them and using that to educate the general public. And so how do we retain that element of the experiential part of the clinic? It's actually working on a particular problem and working with it closely. And then how do we grow the network of public interest technologists and institutions? And so one project that I didn't I'll touch on, actually, it was a very successful project from the summer, was that we got a grant from the Public Interest Technology University Network to run a fellowship program for summer students, and we picked students from 6 different universities, and it was meant to be here at Princeton, but of course it was all virtual this year. But we were able to transition to a virtual program, find them internships with the Federal Trade Commission, with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and with the New York City's Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer. And these students worked on fascinating issues. At CFPB, the student was looking at how bias, whether or not a particular lending agency was using biased predictors. We had students at the FTC working on a public project related to the acquisitions by the big 5 tech companies, and whether there were any patterns to those acquisitions that could suggest to the FTC that there was anti-competitive conduct going on. We had students with the New York City Mayor's Office working on issues related to broadband access, and how do you combat issues related to privacy in the COVID testing. And so these were cutting edge issues that we were able to get the students get really frontline experience doing this. And we kicked it off by having a summer boot camp for the students before they went out, where we talked about policy. We exposed them to very generously a range of high profile people with government roles were agreed to come in and speak to our students and talk about their experiences and their career trajectories. And so that was very helpful for the start of the summer. Then the students went out, did their internships, and during the internships we had a weekly call and where we talked to them about what issues they were confronting, how they could make themselves more productive in the environments that they were in, and really learned about the kind of challenges that the agencies were dealing with and how that can influence some of the research that we develop. And finally we brought them back for a closing seminar, and actually we hope to be able to offer the same program next year, and hopefully it'll be in person, and we can continue that. So that's something, if there are any undergrads listening, that's a great program to apply. We will be putting that out hopefully later this year once the funding is secure. So that's growing the network of public interest technologists and institutions. How do we do that? How do we get others involved in other places? Because it's not, this cannot be just us at Princeton. It has to involve people in different institutions taking the charge, working on these issues. There's plenty to go around, and how do we do that in an effective way? And then the other challenge is, how do we source new projects? What should we prioritize? And what are areas that, and as I said, in terms of project selection, how do we focus on what is the public interest value of the work that we're doing? Are we hitting areas that are underserved so that it's not just the most interesting technological problem, but what's the human dimensions of that problem? Are we attuned to that? Are we finding projects that are hitting areas that don't otherwise get as much attention? And then how do we communicate those results? How do we make sure that our results go out to the broadest range of people who are involved with that? And some of it's not necessarily that we get the most number of eyeballs to read our work. It's how do we communicate it to the right group of people? How do we communicate it in a way that somebody who's in a decision-making role can take some action based on what we've done? So that's where I see our clinic developing, and there's lots of interesting work ahead, and a lot of it depends on partnering with all of you, a lot of you on this conversation, and figuring out what are the areas to work on, what should we focus on, what are the research interests that you'd like. And the last thing I'd say is that a lot of what's been fun about this year is to work directly with, say, Matt, with Arvind, with Jonathan, on problems that, just serving as a consulting role as well, with Fred Weary, where there are people at Princeton who have policy questions that they're asked to engage in, and just to bounce those ideas off, and to have a forum where it's an informal discussion about how to think about policy challenges, how to think about the policymaker you're trying to influence, what matters to them, and how to conceive of your intervention, is something that I would like to keep going and doing. So with that, let me stop and see if there are any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mihir. So just to remind everyone, please put your question in the Q&A box, and I'll be moderating the question. So click on the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can type in your questions, and then I'll be asking them to Mihir. Mihir, one question I had is, you talked about sourcing problems and choosing among problems. I think it may not be clear to some people in the audience that the amount of problems and desire for help maybe exceeds the amount of help that is currently available and engage with the clinic. So could you talk more about some of the policymakers that are asking you for help? What kinds of areas are they in general? And then for the students who are on the call, how can they get involved in helping work, and how can this be used to help further advance their research?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So I think the policymakers have I think two categories of help that they need. One is they would like to understand. So there's an important role for explainers, for policymakers to understand, well, how does machine learning work? Who does it influence? What are the things that we should be watchful for, or the like? And then there are also policy questions around what interventions are worth taking. I mean, so for example, how should we regulate dark patterns? How should we evaluate whether we ought to have a data privacy law? How do we actually regulate in that space? So those are more forward-looking research questions, and then the other one is kind of the explainer role. So there are both coming in, and both are questions. And I think the explainer role for students is very valuable, to actually understand how do you communicate complex technology concepts in simple terms to people who are not aware of it. And that's something that I think is a great opportunity. But there are also opportunities for sort of more advanced students, graduate students, to think about research projects. For example, how do you detect whether a certain entity is behaving anti-competitively. So that would be one example.
So then a follow-up question from one of two follow-up questions very closely related. One is, what are the kinds of outputs or deliverables that students have been able to produce from this? And the second question is, if a student wants to get involved, what should they do next?
Good. So the outputs are papers or actual comments to an agency. So two students from last year wrote comments that went directly to the agency that was regulating in that space, and they wrote it in their own names, but I helped them organize and present their thoughts. And that was something that they did in the independent work clinic, and this is for undergraduates, and then they were able to get it out through there, and I can see potentially doing white papers and the like that we can put up on our website if it's not necessarily a direct agency problem that students are responding to. So that would be the kind of outputs that students would be able to get involved in. That would be taking the independent work seminar class, which is going to be offered next semester for the computer science juniors and seniors, and then we'll see what other kind of course offerings we'll have that will allow students to participate in this work directly. But my hope is that every semester there will be an opportunity for a student to join the clinic and run with a particular project. And the other thing is, it's not one of the things which I really emphasize in the seminar is that it's a collaborative project. So it's not just one student working on it. It's working with other people is a big part of the learning experience.
Okay, thank you, Mihir. And if you want to follow up on those questions, the people who asked them, if you have more specific questions, I'm sure you could email Mihir and he'd be happy to answer in more specifics. There's a question about the list of policy roles that you provided, so supporter, explainer, that kind of topology. Yep. And I'm wondering, this questioner is wondering about how the clinic works fits in that topology. Would you say the clinic is largely in one of those buckets or spread over several? And then do you have plans to move potentially into other buckets that we're not currently working in?
Yeah, so that's a good, let me just pull it up so that we have it. So the clinic, it's a little bit of a hard question because I think the clinic's going to try to support all of them because they're different researchers at Princeton have different interests. And sometimes in the supporter role, for example, I'll give you specific examples, right? So in the supporter role, if Matt, you're invited to testify, about the limits of prediction, I think a great clinic project would be to have students help you prepare for that testimony and ask you hard questions and in turn, learn from that experience, and then hopefully that'll be of value to you as well. The explainer role is something we've been talking about. Advisory role is something where I think that goes more behind the scenes, and again, it's something which I think I would sort of encourage researchers and faculty who have that, if they want to talk with me, and we're trying to develop a way in which others can participate in this as well, is how do you play the advisory role? What are the kinds of questions that matter to policymakers and help them through that? The theorist role is again one where I think the clinic is going to be less involved in. It's not necessarily putting out new theories. Almost by design, what we're trying to do is to collect evidence and present facts, and it's a very fact-driven inquiry. And so we're asking, how, and this sort of reflects, I should say, my personal background biases this a little bit, where there's legal academics who love theories, and appellate lawyers who love large principles. My background is from litigation, is that I really care about the facts. What's the story, or how does it affect people? And so the theorist is a role which, again, I think we can play this role as a clinic of bringing in projects and having the theorists have that bounced against different people from different backgrounds. And then the advocate role is the one that's the most interesting one, I think, because we uh, and the most challenging one, because what we're trying to do is advocate for the public interest, and I see a very important role for the clinic to do that. But we're going to do that in a nonpartisan way, and it's not designed to be. Uh, uh, I think we get credibility by being an advocate for interests that are underrepresented, or you know playing a role of an advocate is a tricky one, and we have to be mindful of how best we can do that. But there are a lot of opportunities to play that role. I hope that was helpful.
Yep.
Yep.
So again, please type your questions into the Q&A box. So the next question is actually several interrelated questions. Does the clinic seek out policy problems that are of special interest? Or is there so much external demand the clinic doesn't need to seek out problems? And then I think this could also be related to a question about if a graduate student has a certain interest, like let's say they're interested in algorithms in criminal justice, or they're interested in smart cities, does the clinic have like a set of people who want to work on those things with them? And like if there's a graduate student looking for a research site, for example, can the clinic help with that? So that's question number one. How do graduate students get involved in the clinic? And do all the projects have the potential to produce academic output? So these are sort of variations on themes we heard in the earlier questions, but I think more from the perspective of grad students about how to get involved, what the clinic can enable, and what are the kinds of outputs.
Yeah, those are all great questions. So in terms of how the clinic can get involved, I think is I would think of it at two stages of your work. At the conceptual stage, uh, I really want, and maybe there's a way to figure this out programmatically, is to make it available to maybe office hours or something like that. But some systematic way of doing this, and love to talk to people about it. But the important thing is at the stage of designing your research, what are the questions you're asking? Because sometimes if it's just you're very close to a topic that a policymaker might find interesting, but you've asked a question that really is not directly applicable, and so will not get a policymaker to pay attention. And so is there a way that we can please talk about the kinds of questions that you're looking at to then be able to formulate it in a way that can influence policy? And then once you're sort of doing the research, stay as close in contact as you'd like to be. But then at the end of that, how do you publicize that research? How do you partner with people to get that information out? And that's again a role in which the clinic can play, can really help, and is something that I think for graduate students in particular, to find that their work can have a public audience is really important. And so, in terms of sourcing projects, I think we do have a lot of inbound inquiries, and there's a lot of a lot of interest and a lot of work going on. But I'm never. I love talking about these topics, and if it's certainly worth an hour just to walk through things and then to figure out, okay, is there something more here, or is there something that perhaps can is not something the clinic can get behind. And as over the years we develop more experience in these areas, we can figure out how do we get more resources to help students. Does that make yeah?
And then papers for graduate students. Do all
Papers.
the
Yep.
projects have the potential to produce academic outputs?
Yep. So that is a key piece of the puzzle that we're trying to work through. And I'll give the example of the EdTech paper that we're working on, that some of you who are on the call may be directly participating in. Is that there's a strong public need to think about how these communication technologies, what are the privacy and security implications. At the same time, to work on that, there has to be an academic paper that gives graduate students the you're here to publish research papers and not simply to write white papers. And so we're trying to do both. And so there will be a public research component to it. And that part actually does fit well with the clinic's goal of putting out high quality research into the public sphere. So we can't be explainers of everything. We can't touch on every topic. But the things we touch on should be of sufficient quality. And so actually the test of whether some of the work that is for, especially now Matt addressing graduate students, the test of saying, okay, is this research worthy publication quality is a good test as well for how serious of an intervention we're making. Is it a high quality product? But I can see instances where that comes into tension, and some of that's going to be based on whether the graduate student in question is willing to volunteer their time to do it. And I'll give one example. Actually, Ryan Amos, we worked on a paper, just a short little thing on how class action notices are used, certain what domains they use, and that we wrote that paper, and I think that was very. It got to the FTC, it got to some other people, and I think it was very helpful for Ryan to actually have written that little piece, which is 3-4 pages, and he volunteered his time to do it. But I think it was helpful for him.
Okay, so maybe that's a good way to end as an example of a graduate student project that ended up having an impact on policy, because I think that's one of the things the clinic really wants to enable. And so please join me in thanking Mihir. I guess I can clap on behalf of everyone. I know you can't see them, but I'm sure they're clapping. So for those of you who are new to the Center for Information Technology Policy and CITP, if you liked what you saw, we have a weekly seminar series every Tuesday, 12:30 to 1:30. And you can learn more about them at our website, citp.princeton.edu. And thank you, everyone, and goodbye.